Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be talking to you today and really sorry that I'm not able to do so in person. My name is Melissa Kline Struhl. I'm the executive director of Lookit, taking over from Kim Scott several months ago. And I'm going to be talking today about doing asynchronous studies online. You'll notice that I've put both Lookit and Children Helping Science on the title of my slide, which is partly because I can start with an announcement for you all, which is that if you've used the website Children Helping Science or Lookit, we are actually combining forces. You can find us right now called Children Helping Science, powered by Lookit. And we're still at the lookit.mit.edu address. And Mark will be able to talk a little bit more about that merger later on, I think. So I titled this talk, we're learning about doing asynchronous studies. So just to make sure that we're clear on that definition, asynchronous studies is going to be studies that families can choose to participate at any time. Synchronous is studies where you're going to need to be in sync with that family. So the families will sign up for a slot and then get on a video call with the researcher to actually do the study there on the video call. And the first thing to know about the Lookit platform is that we actually let families advertise and see both of these together. So if you go to the Lookit page right now, you'll see something like this with all the studies that are kind of currently available. And then if parents want, they can click to see either just studies that you can take right this minute or studies where you're going to schedule a time in the future. So I'll start by just giving a really quick overview of some contrasts between asynchronous and synchronous studies. When we say asynchronous, the big thing to keep in mind is that the whole thing is asynchronous. So that includes consenting, the whole study itself, and debriefing without any live involvement from a person. Whereas on the other hand, for a synchronous study, anything that you can get up on a video call is kind of live for possibly inclusion in a study. Some other things to keep in mind here. So first of all, with the Lookit platform, you can either use our experimenter or you can bring in another study that you've built to run online. And that's also how we do synchronous studies as well, just with links to Zoom or whatever else you're using. Some other things to keep in mind are that with the Lookit platform, you're going to be accessing all the data right after your study. If you're doing a synchronous study or another external study like on Zoom, you're going to need to combine data about the kids that you test between Lookit and your system. And one way to think of the trade-off that we have here is that asynchronous studies may be faster and more convenient for families to participate in whenever they like, but synchronous studies are really going to be where you're going to have more personal interaction for the families. Another way you can think about this trade-off is that asynchronous studies are really great when you want things to be very standardized, and Zoom studies or video call synchronous studies can be great where you want interactive or child contingent studies that might depend on something the child does during the course of the experiment. And Mark will talk a lot more about those studies. So I'll start with just a brief note. This is a tutorial, so I'll start with a brief note about how you actually could get started running studies on Lookit. And there are a few key components, and I'll also share you some links to tutorials to get you started with all of this. The first kind of procedural hurdle that everybody needs to get over with is that your institution needs to sign a data agreement with MIT. We've got agreements with about 80 institutions at this point, including some in the EU, Japan, and the UK. So you should start by actually checking with us to see whether you actually already have a data agreement that the PI can be added to. People sometimes wonder about how IRB works. You're going to do your IRB process just as you would otherwise. So you might build your entire study and consent form and everything in Lookit, and then show that to your IRB if that's the way that your IRB operates. Again, I'll show you our consent form just briefly, and we encourage you to use our consent form because it was sort of developed for this particular context. So if that language works for you in your institution, that's great. If you need to change the language, you'll be able to modify it as well. And then as for actually learning how to use Lookit in a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to talk about today, you can visit our documentation, which is https://lookit.readthedocs.io, and joining our Slack channel, which you can find out about at that link. And I also want to put in a personal invitation for anyone at this workshop to just write me an email if you're getting started or if you have questions about whether Lookit platform is going to work for you. So once you've decided to use Lookit, there's a first choice you're going to need to make, which is, are you going to use the Lookit experiment builder, or are you going to use a study that you built in some other program? So the Lookit Experiment Builder is going to be what you want to have. If you want to collect webcam data that's timed to study data, we can't record the webcam data if you're actually leaving the site, because you do just leave the site fully if you're doing an external study. I want to put out a special call for the Lookit Experiment Builder if you have never coded anything before. As I'm going through this talk, you're going to see some text that looks like it's programming, and it is. It's a language called JSON, and the tutorials that we have are specifically designed to get you from you've never coded anything before to you can use JSON, which basically winds up acting like a really powerful Google form to enter all of the information in all of the different pieces of your study. And another way to think about why you might like to choose the Lookit Experiment Builder is if you want both templates for parts of studies that are specifically designed for online and for studies with kids, but then you also want really fine control over all of the pieces of your study, the actual experiment that you really care about. The other option is that you can build a study anywhere you like on a platform like Qualtrics, on something self-hosted, really anything that you might already be using online. And if you already have a study running and you'd like to start recruiting through Lookit, is one really, really good reason to go ahead and use that study that you've already built. You're not going to have to rebuild that study in order to use Lookit. Another great reason is if you don't want to take the time right now to learn a new framework, if you're very, very comfortable building the study, or if the study that you have is tricky to set up and only kind of works in one other program, that might be a great reason. And of course, if you don't need webcam video, if you're okay to do an asynchronous study with, say, a link to the survey, you're happy to have families attest that, it's really the 8-year-old filling out the study and not the parent, that could be a great fit. So now let's talk about how you would actually make a study and get it online. Let's say that you wanted to get this first study on the left-hand corner up here actually up and running, appearing live on the search page for families to find. The first thing to know, so families are going to click on that link and then they'll see a details page like this. And all of the text that you're sitting here is coming from the researchers. And so that's sort of the general pattern that you'll see throughout this site, is that the layout, like the fact that there's that column on the left showing the name of the study in a picture, the layout is coming from Lookit, and then the text, so like all of these paragraphs you're seeing here about what the study is going to actually be about, is all coming from the researcher. And how are you going to get all that information in there? Well, here you really are just going to fill out a form. So I'll walk you through some of the main pieces of the information that you're going to provide. And I will tell you when things start to split between the experiment builder and an external study. Right now, what you're seeing is exactly the same if you wanted to just give us a link to a study that you're already running. So you're going to tell us the name of your study. You're going to set some basic parameters that are going to determine how Lookit shows it to people. So we can either show it in the search page or not, depending on how you're recruiting. And then this first checkbox here is going to be the big decision for your asynchronous study, which is, are you going to post an external link or are you going to use the builder? And then also this is the box that you would check here if you were going to be doing a synchronous study rather than an asynchronous one. So we'll leave this unchecked. You can upload an image that you want to use for the study. And then we're going to give you boxes here where you can enter that intro. So you can choose the text that you want to appear right up front on that search page, and then the text that you'll want to show inside. Continuing on the form, we're also going to give the ability to recruit the kids that you actually want to recruit into your study. And we do this a few different ways on Lookit. So the first is that we're going to give you get to write just a description of who this study is for. And then we also are going to give you some ways to enter data, which we will actually use to determine who gets an email inviting a child to a study and what studies you see on the search page. If families have like a drop-down box, they can pick just show studies for my 1-year-old or just show studies for my 3-year-old who's also learning another language at preschool. So here you can either add specific requirements, and these are basically demographic information that families have already shared with us. If you're primarily focused on the age of the kids that you want, then you can enter the minimum and maximum ages here. Okay, now we're going to take a little split path for those studies that are either external or internal. If you already have a study and you just want to advertise and show it to families on Lookit, at this point, what you're going to see right here, so you'll enter which lab you're with, but then with the experiment details, the study URL is going to be the link that families are going to follow when they leave Lookit and go to your page. And then right now we're just asking you what platform your study is running on, because we're trying to get a better sense of what people are using, and that will help us sort of make better tools for people as we start to figure out, what are the sites that we could really kind of integrate more nicely with. On the other hand, if you had a Lookit built study, you would have been doing all of the same overall. You're still entering who should be recruited into your study. And then at the bottom, there's going to be another text box. And this text box is just, it's going to open you up like a nice big browser window that you can actually type things into. So you're not going to be downloading or installing anything on your computer. You're just going to be on the Lookit website. And for this text box, you're going to write or paste in the code of your experiment, exactly what you want to happen all the way through. And we'll talk just a little bit about what that looks like a little bit later on. Once you've built your entire study, the next step and last step before your study goes live is to get some peer review of your study. The reason that we do this is because everybody on the Lookit platform is sharing a reputation. We want to make sure that when families come, they have experiences that are smooth, welcoming, make sense, generally speaking. And that can be really hard to do when you've been sitting in front of your study for maybe quite a while getting it put together. So I'm showing you on the right here just some of the live feed from the last several days of our Slack channel. So the way that this works is that people just post on the Slack channel saying that they would like some feedback and give a link to the study. And then we have a form that another researcher can use to fill out how their experience was. So we're primarily here focused on the parent's experience rather than the scientific merit. Like, we're not really so much concerned about like, is your counterbalancing exactly the way you want it to, but rather things like, if I don't know what's going on in this study, did I know what I was supposed to do? Did I know where my child was supposed to be sitting? Things like this. And really the two key pieces of advice that I have for this part of review is the first is try it on a second computer. Your participants are going to be using all kinds of laptops, and you can't have kind of full control over every single one, but going from one laptop to two laptops is typically the hardest step. And so if you can recruit a friend or use another laptop, a lot of times if there's just like a little problem in the code, it'll pop right out when you've got that second computer. And then the other thing, of course, is to have someone who's never seen it take the entire study from beginning to end, kind of without any of that foreknowledge. So now let's imagine that you've got your study all the way through, you've gotten peer review, you submitted it to Lookit, and then we have an internal approval queue, which is taking about a week right now for us to just go through and make sure everything's good and launch your study on the website. So a family is getting ready to take your study. They might go through the search bar, find the study that they want to take. They read the study overview, it looks pretty good to them. And then when they're ready to go, they're going to pick which kid from their profile is going to participate, and then click on this Participate Now button right here. And if this was an external study, that Participate Now button is just a link to your study. So at that point, you're done with Lookit, you're going to go off and do the rest of it. But if it's a Lookit built study, you clicked on that Participate Now link, and usually you're going to start by seeing something that looks kind of like this. So you load this page and right away your browser says, hey, this website wants to use your microphone and your camera. Is that okay? So this is the hardest part probably for families just from a technical aspect. They have read something about how they're going to get videotaped, but it's still a matter of getting your own laptop to do it. So we try to walk people through this pretty carefully. So you can say, yes, it's okay for the microphone and camera to be used. And then we actually show you a picture of yourself so you can see how you look in the film, see what's going on. You can change your microphone or your camera if you need to. And then we'll actually ask people to check, make sure that you can see yourself in the webcam and actually reload it just to make sure none of our permissions get reset. And then just make some noise so that we can hear you talking, so that we know that the recorder, that the family is going to be able to send both video and audio data back to the researcher. And then at the bottom here, we have some setup tips and more help for people who are getting their webcam set up for a study. Typically after that, you're going to see a consent form. The way that this works on Lookit is we give people a consent document to read. They can save it if they want. And then typically we're then going to ask parents to read this out loud, the statement that you see here on the screen. One reason for that is that it makes sure that we really, really are sure that families know that they're being recorded and that they've had a chance to read and understand that consent form. And then you can, again, just note here that you're seeing some of our standard template language, which you can use. You can also update that language if you want to. All right, so you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, so I saw the webcam set up and I saw the consent form, but what if I usually do something first before the consent form, like give instructions or something like that? Well, sort of the good news and the bad news about Lookit is that you're in control of the whole show. So you told Lookit, if you were writing the study, to show the video configuration page and to show the consent page. And the way that you can think about how these experiments are structured when you're building them is that you are in charge of the content of what people are going to see and the order of what people are going to see. We refer to these as frames, so like little chunks of an experience, which I'll show you on the next slide here. So this is just text. If you're not using to look at code, you might be wondering, like, what am I going to do with this, or how do I read this? And my two answers to you is that ultimately you're going to type it into a text box on your laptop or your computer. When you're at the Lookit website, you're going to just type it into the form, just like you would type in the title of the study. And as for understanding it, I'm just including a link here again to the documentation. We've got a big tutorial that's kind of really designed to walk you through this from the basics. So what are you going to actually put in that text? Usually Lookit experiment is split up into two pieces, the frames and the sequence. So the frames is where you're actually going to say what should show up. And then the sequence is going to be the order of those chunks of the study in the order that you wanted. So if you wanted to put something in between video configuration and the video consent, you would just take the frame that was labeled pre-study and stick it in there. And the key way to think about the frames in Lookit is that they require more or less work from you depending on how much stuff you want to vary. And what we aim for when we give you these frames, so these are something like we've got several that I can show you, but we kind of keep adding them over time. And when we give a frame, we're trying to take care of everything that's never going to change and only give you control over the things that actually vary from study to study. So if you looked at our video configuration form as it just shows up automatically, that frame without any other changes, you can see that there's something a little funny going on down here. Under setup tips, it says, this is a standard frame. You probably want to put it at the very start of your study. You can customize this text. So we probably don't want to actually show that to families. So what are we going to do? And the answer to that question is going to be right up here at the top. So I've got an open bracket, frames, another open bracket, video configuration, frame. And then those next two lines, those are going to be the spots where we're going to type something in to let Lookit know, hey, what kind of frame should I show? You should show the one where we get to configure all the video. And I want to choose the text that goes there. Everything else can be the same, but I want to choose what it says. So for instance, for my particular lab and my particular study, maybe I'm going to give people my phone number so they can call me for help. And that'll make that frame show up with that exact text in that spot. And I know that that was a very fast introduction to especially the kind of JSON frame sequence part of this. There is an extensive tutorial on our documentation, which is designed exactly to basically walk you through both getting all of the pieces of a new lab set up to operate on Lookit and all the way through sort of understanding a study and then even building one on your own. So I really encourage you to look at that. All right, so if we're kind of taking our mental model of where we are in our journey right now, you can imagine we made a study, we put it on Lookit, a family found it and they took the study. Congratulations. So continuing with the internal study, if you used our experiment builder, you're also going to be able to use Lookit to get back all of the data that you just collected online. And the way that we do this is we're actually going to use those consent videos that we saw again at the beginning. It's always possible that something could go wrong and families could have unintentionally left their camera on, or maybe a kid even got to the website and did the whole thing by themselves without a parent or guardian in the room. And so here what you're checking is you just get to watch that consent video and say, like, is a caregiver really there? Do they really say that sentence that they're supposed to say? And if you, the researcher, can say like, yes, that's it, they're ready, then once you've said that that's good, then you're going to be given access to all of the data that you can download related to that study. And you can even then use Lookit to message families. So for instance, if you've got people who you want to pay like a Amazon gift card or another form of compensation to, you can use this. We have these message types up here because we're trying to make sure that families have control over how much email they get from us. So here we're going to basically ask families like, hey, do you want to hear from us if we have another related study for you? Do you want to hear from us if we want to pay you for the study, right? So people might want to make different choices there. So if we zoom back out to our asynchronous versus synchronous studies, that was just a really brief tour of kind of everything that you can do on Lookit with an asynchronous study. So just a reminder that you can also run these synchronous studies on Lookit too. And right now, the way that we do that is just as an external study, just like Qualtrics. You could also just drop in a link to some way to schedule video calls with people. So a lot of people use a website like Calendly. So similarly to what you saw before, if there was that participate now button, people click on that link, they go to Calendly, and then they run through whatever your setup is for selecting an appointment. And then maybe you're going to send them emails. Maybe you're going to make an appointment to get together on a Zoom call. From there on, if you've done other live online studies, it's going to feel pretty familiar from that point on. But now that we've done this, we're just trying to make our choices between asynchronous and synchronous. I want to kind of point out the big advantages of the synchronous studies, or that we actually get to interact and be a little bit more personal with the families, and where there's stuff that really needs to depend on the behavior of the baby or the child during the study, then you might really want to have that control. And something that we can think about just at the end here for those asynchronous studies is how we can get at least some of those benefits over into an asynchronous study. So some tips for kind of making your studies extra good if you want to. See if this loads. Right, so this isn't a video call or even a real lab visit, but you can still take the time to make that experience as warm and welcoming as you can, right? So you popped up that first introduction where you helped the family just get their webcam and everything straightened out. And then you really want to think about the whole experience that a family is going to have from when they first click on the participate now button to when they end. So if you're kind of making an analogy to the lab visit, this is like from the moment that a family gets out of the car in the parking lot, or wherever else that kind of inertial spot might be. Other things to remember if you're trying to really make a great study on Lookit is to be respectful of people and their time. And so that's both in terms of making things clear and easy, making sure that you take the time to explain it, making sure that you're being inviting and interested in really just sort of genuinely interested in telling the family about the study, which in the lab, we definitely always are. Like, families, like they've got a lot of time, they've got a little time, but every RA who's done that, like we're always ready to chat with families about what the study is about. And there are ways that you can do that and Lookit as well, kind of give people the opportunity to learn a little bit more if they want to and if they have time. And something else that is really important for these asynchronous studies is to take kind of a longer than you might think pause to think about inclusivity and accessibility of your study. And the reason that I'm really stressing this is because of the fact that it's asynchronous. You don't have time, you don't have the opportunity the way you might during a video call to kind of say like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't realize, oh, actually like your child is hard of hearing. Is that going to be a problem? Oh, no, actually it's going to be fine for this study. So like maybe if your study has some noises in it, but they weren't crucial, maybe you would want to include something that says like, hey, there's going to be noises in this study, but if your child is hard of hearing, that's actually fine. As long as they can see the screen, this is going to be a good experience for them. So you do kind of want to think about that sort of branching tree of different families, different experiences, different possibilities to make sure that the most number of people kind of landing on that experience are going to have a good time. I'm going to pick on Michaela DeBolt just for a minute. If I was live, I would try to show this to you. I'm not going to try to play the video over Zoom recording right here. But this is just a really lovely example of some things that you can do with an asynchronous study. So basically the way that they start off is she just actually has a video where she's going to explain a lot of the detail of what the study is about. And something that I want to highlight especially here is that she's including the same information in the video as in the text below. That means that people who prefer to learn by reading versus video are going to be able to do it. People who are super comfortable reading in English versus might prefer to hear it or be able to rewind or go back or read again. People are going to have options there. And then also, of course, it's a chance for families just to see like, hey, there's a real person behind this study who actually specifically would love for you to do this and have a good time today. Special nice job shout out for Michaela there. And then the other thing you might be thinking about is, well, can I get anything more personalized or child contingent into an asynchronous study? And this is a place where, again, like you can contact me, I'm happy to troubleshoot. When you're thinking about that trade-off between asynchronous, you don't have to schedule someone to actually meet with the family. It's a little bit more convenient for families to go. If you want to be able to kind of get the advantage of speed and volume from an asynchronous study, you might be able to get it with some of these tricks. So for instance, just to make things more fun, if there's like a little monster character in your story, if the color doesn't matter, maybe the child could pick the color of the monster and then you could change the color of the monster depending on what the kid wanted to see. You could make a story where every time you came along to something that was referring to the child, you actually filled in the child's first name from their profile. You can use settings in that JSON file that I was mentioning to do things like either have the storybook go automatically or include like a next button so that families can choose to read it, be ready to go, and then click the next button when they're ready to see something else. If you're doing things like having a baby who's attentive to a screen before starting a trial, see if you can enlist the family, right? Like it may be the case that the caregiver is actually in a great position to tell you like, okay, my baby is calm, they're attending towards the screen, I'm going to hit the space bar to start a trial. Some other really cool tricks you can do is you can actually calculate and use response data as you go. So you could even imagine having a family that does like a give end task on video and enters their answers, and then you could show different studies to like a 2-knower versus a 3-knower. Or maybe with some work, I've actually seen people who can habituate to a stimulus using caregiver assistance in an asynchronous study, which is super cool. But ultimately, sometimes what you need for your study really just is a live interaction. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark so he can tell you a lot more about those synchronous studies. Thank you all so much for your time. I forgot to put it in my presentation, but I will give to Mark a slide that's got some of the links that I was mentioning before. And thank you all so much for your time. All right, have a great rest of your conference.